Think about this for a second. Can one person, one single teenager, actually break the entire world? Is it possible that your life, your home, and everything you know was shaped by a few angry kings who were actually cousins? Most people will tell you World War I was a tragic accident. They say the world just tripped into a dark hole, but that's a lie. The truth is much scarier. The truth is that the most powerful men on earth spent decades building a trap. Then they sat back and waited for someone to step in it. Imagine a room filled to the ceiling with dry wood. Every inch of it is soaked in gasoline. Everyone is standing there, smiling and shaking hands. But they are all holding lit matches. They are just waiting for the first person to blink. That was Europe in 1914. It wasn't peace, it was a countdown. Empires were getting too greedy. Armies were getting too fast. And a tiny country was about to pull the pin on a grenade that would change human history forever. You've heard about the assassination, but that wasn't the cause. That was just the ending. Today we are going back to the beginning. We are going to see how the trap was set. By the time we finish, you will see the world differently. You'll see why wars still happen today, and why the peace we have right now is actually very fragile. And if you stay with me until the very end, I'm going to show you something chilling. It's a secret letter sent just hours before the first shot. It proves that the most powerful man in the world tried to stop the war at the last second, only to realize he had lost control of his own machine. We are breaking down the 4 hidden forces that turned the world into a graveyard. M.A.I.N. Each one is a gear in a machine of death. If you want to know why the old world had to die, you have to look at the egos and the greed. Let's peel back the curtain. Let's find out why the world actually went to war. What happens when you give a bully a bigger stick? In 1914, every leader in Europe was obsessed with having the biggest stick. This is militarism. But it's not just about having an army. It's a sickness. It's the belief that your army is the only thing that makes you a man. It's the idea that if you have a problem, you don't talk, you crush. Let's look at the biggest rivalry of them all. Britain and Germany. For centuries, Britain ruled the waves. They had the biggest navy, and they were proud of it. But then Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II decided he wanted that crown. He didn't just want a navy, he wanted to scare the world. In 1906, the British launched a ship called the HMS Dreadnought. It was a monster. It was so fast and so powerful that it made every other ship on Earth look like a toy boat. Did this make the world safer? No, it started a panic. Germany started building their own dreadnoughts. Britain responded by building even more. They were spending money they didn't have, building giant steel coffins, just to prove who was boss. Think about the tension in the air. People in London and Berlin weren't reading about peace in the newspapers. They were reading about how many cannons the enemy had built that week. The world was turning into a giant warehouse for gunpowder. Now let's talk about the men in the fancy uniforms. The generals. These men didn't think like you and me. They thought in numbers and maps. They became obsessed with speed. They believed that the next war wouldn't be won by the bravest soldiers, but by the fastest trains. Every country in Europe had a mobilization plan. These were giant books, thousands of pages long, that told every single soldier exactly which train to get on the moment war was declared. The most terrifying of these was the Schlieffen Plan. Germany was terrified of being surrounded. They had France on one side and Russia on the other. Their solution? A plan so rigid, it was like a death trap. They decided that if they ever got into a fight with Russia, they would have to attack France first. And to do it, they would have to march through Belgium, a tiny peaceful country that had nothing to do with their problems. There was no plan B. There was no wait and see. The generals told the politicians, if we don't strike now, we lose. Imagine a train barreling down a mountain at 100 miles an hour with no brakes. That was Europe's military. Once the first soldier stepped onto a train, the war could not be stopped. The world was no longer being run by humans with hearts. It was being run by stopwatches and steel. The generals were just waiting for a reason to hit start. To understand why Germany was so obsessed with ships, you have to understand the man at the top, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He wasn't just a world leader, he was the grandson of the British Queen Victoria. When he was a boy, he would visit England and watch the massive British fleet sail by. He didn't just admire them, he was jealous. He felt like the poor cousin with a small army. When he became Kaiser, he decided that if he couldn't be loved by England, he would be feared by them. He surrounded himself with yes-men and admirals who told him that a great nation is nothing without a great navy. He spent millions money that could have fed his people on steel and cannons. It wasn't about trade or defense. It was about his own ego. Every time Britain launched a ship, Wilhelm took it as a personal insult. He was turning a family rivalry into a global death match. In 1906, the British did something that changed the world forever. They launched the HMS Dreadnought. This wasn't just a new ship, it was a revolution. It was so fast and carried so many giant guns that it made every other ship on the planet obsolete overnight. But here is the irony. By building the perfect ship, Britain actually destroyed its own lead. Since all old ships were now useless, Germany realized they could start the race from zero. Now it was a fair fight. Both countries entered a building fever. In the factories of Sheffield and the docks of Hamburg, the hammers never stopped. Workers were building machines that they knew would one day be used to kill people just like them. The atmosphere in Europe wasn't just tense, it was vibrating with the sound of riveting guns and boiling steel. While Germany was obsessed with trains and battleships, France was obsessed with élan, the spirit of the attack. The French generals believed that bravery was more important than bullets. Because of this, they refused to change their uniforms. While the rest of the world was moving to camouflaged browns and greens, the French army marched out in bright blue coats and glowing red pants. When people warned the French government that these uniforms were basically target practice for modern machine guns, the Minister of War famously screamed, "No, the red trousers are France." This was the madness of militarism. These leaders were so in love with the glory of war that they forgot war had changed. They were preparing to send millions of young men into a meat grinder of modern technology while wearing outfits from the 1800s. They weren't planning for a war of survival, they were planning for a parade that would end in a massacre. If militarism was about the big stick, alliances were about the secret handshake. Imagine you're on a school playground. If you get into a fight with one kid, it's a bad day. But imagine if every kid on that playground had signed a secret contract in blood. A contract that said if anyone touches my friend, I have to jump in and punch them. Suddenly, a small argument over a toy turns into a riot involving every single student. That was Europe in 1914. Leaders didn't trust each other. They were terrified of being left alone in a fight. So they started making deals behind closed doors. Germany made a pact with Austria-Hungary. France made a pact with Russia. These weren't just friendships, they were tripwires. Most of the public didn't even know the full details of these deals. The people were being walked toward a cliff by leaders who had tied everyone's shoelaces together. They thought these alliances would prevent war because no one would be crazy enough to attack everyone at once. They were dead wrong. It didn't prevent the war, it just made sure that when the war happened, it would be a global catastrophe. To see how crazy this was, you have to look at the telegrams sent just days before the shooting started. They are called the Willy-Nicky telegrams. Why? Because they were sent between Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and Tsar Nicholas of Russia. Here is the kicker. They were cousins. They literally called each other Willy and Nicky in their letters. As the world moved toward war, these two men were frantically texting each other, the 1914 version of texting anyway. They were trying to tell each other, hey, let's not do this. My generals are pushing me, but I don't want to fight you. It sounds like a movie script. Two of the most powerful men on earth were trying to stop a war through personal letters, but it was too late. The alliances they had signed years ago were stronger than their family blood. Their own generals told them that the trains were already moving and couldn't be stopped. The kings had built a machine so big that even the kings couldn't turn it off. For a long time, Great Britain tried to stay out of it. They sat on their island and watched the crazy Europeans argue. But there was one tiny problem, a 75-year-old piece of paper. Back in 1839, Britain had signed a treaty promising to protect the neutrality of Belgium. At the time, it seemed like a small, boring legal detail. No one thought it would lead to millions of deaths. But remember the Schlieffen Plan. To attack France, Germany had to march through Belgium. When the German Chancellor heard that Britain might go to war just to protect Belgium, he was shocked. He famously asked, "You're going to war over a scrap of paper?" The answer was yes. Because of that one signature on that one old document, the British Empire, which covered a quarter of the globe, was dragged into the mud. Because of that scrap of paper, soldiers from Australia, Canada, India, and Africa were now headed to a war they didn't start for a country they had never seen. Think of the world in 1914, like a giant birthday cake. But the people at the party aren't sharing. They are screaming, pushing, and grabbing as much as they can. This is imperialism. It's the hunger for more land, more resources, and more control. By the time the war started, the powerful nations of Europe had already conquered almost all of Africa and large parts of Asia. But they weren't satisfied. They wanted it all. In this world, if you weren't an empire, you were a victim. The leaders in London, Berlin, and Paris believed that if their country stopped growing, it would die. It was a zero-sum game. That's a fancy way of saying, if you get a piece of land, I lose. This created a constant low-level fever of anxiety. Every time a new gold mine was found in Africa or a new trade route opened in China, the European powers reached for their guns. They weren't just neighbors, they were rivals competing for the championship of the world. To see how close the world came to war before 1914, you have to look at Africa. In the late 1800s, European leaders literally sat in a room in Berlin with a map and a ruler. They drew lines across Africa, dividing up people and land they had never even seen. They didn't ask the people living there for permission. They just took it. But here is where it gets dangerous for Europe. They started bumping into each other. In places like Morocco and Egypt, French and German soldiers were staring each other down over desert borders. Several times the world almost went to war years early because of these colonial tantrums. These empires were like two giant ships sailing too close together in a storm. Eventually they were going to collide. The tension in Europe wasn't just about European borders, it was about who got to own the rest of the world. While Britain and Germany were fighting over new land, other empires were falling apart. The Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were like old crumbling houses. They were losing control of their land in Eastern Europe, especially in a place called the Balkans. This created a power vacuum. When a giant empire starts to shrink, everyone else rushes in to grab the leftovers. Russia wanted a path to the sea. Austria wanted to keep its people from rebelling. And the small countries like Serbia just wanted to be free. The Balkans became the most dangerous place on earth because it was the one spot where all the imperial greed collided at once. It was a black hole of diplomacy. Everyone wanted a piece of the Balkan cake, and they were willing to kill millions of people to get the biggest slice. Nationalism is a tricky word. Today we think of it as being proud of our country. But in 1914, it was something much more aggressive. It was the belief that your people, your language, and your flag were better than everyone else's, and that anyone who stood in your way deserved to be crushed. It wasn't just love of country, it was hate of the neighbor. Imagine living in an empire where you aren't allowed to speak your own language. Imagine being told that you belong to a king who lives hundreds of miles away and doesn't care if you live or die. That was the reality for millions of people in Eastern Europe. They didn't want to be part of an empire. They wanted to be their own boss. They wanted their own borders. This desire for freedom was like a wildfire, and it was burning right in the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Enter the Black Hand. This wasn't just a group of angry students. It was a secret society of Serbian nationalists. They didn't just want independence, they wanted Greater Serbia. They were backed by powerful people, and they were willing to use terror to get what they wanted. One of their members was a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip. He wasn't some master assassin. He was a skinny, sickly kid who felt like he had nothing to lose. To him, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand wasn't a person. He was a symbol of the empire that was suffocating his people. Nationalism had convinced Princip that murdering a man and his wife would somehow make his country free. It turned a teenager into a monster, and it turned a political disagreement into a death sentence for millions. Why did Russia care about what happened to a tiny country like Serbia? It comes down to a specific type of nationalism called pan-Slavism. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, saw himself as the big brother to all Slavic people. He believed that if he didn't protect his Slavic brothers in Serbia, he would look weak. Nationalism made it impossible for leaders to back down. If the Tsar blinked, his people might revolt. If the Kaiser blinked, he might lose his throne. Everyone was trapped by their own pride. They had spent years telling their citizens that they were the strongest and the best. Now they were forced to prove it. Nationalism took away their ability to be reasonable. It turned a local crime in the streets of Sarajevo into a must-win fight for the honor of the entire Russian Empire. Now, all the pieces are on the board. The weapons are ready. Militarism. The secret deals are signed. Alliances. The land has been stolen. Imperialism. And the hatred is boiling over. Nationalism. On June 28, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand decided to take a car ride through the streets of Sarajevo. He thought he was on a peace mission. He didn't know he was driving into a room filled with gasoline. When Gavrilo Princip stepped out of that crowd and pulled the trigger, he didn't just kill a man, he tripped the wire. The alliances began to click into place like a giant machine. Russia started moving its trains. Germany started checking its stopwatches. Britain started looking at its scrap of paper. The world that had looked so peaceful just days before was gone. In less than a month, the most civilized nations on Earth were at each other's throats, starting a fire that wouldn't go out for 4 long, bloody years. So the spark was lit. But here is the most heartbreaking part of the story. It didn't have to happen. Even after the guns were loaded and the trains were huming, there was one final moment where the world almost saved itself. I promised you a secret at the beginning, a look at a letter that most people never talk about. Just hours before the war began, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany sent a desperate, frantic telegram to his cousin, the Tsar of Russia. He realized that the main machine he helped build was about to crush him. He begged his cousin to stop the troops. He realized that once the first shot was fired, civilization was over. But when he turned to his own generals and screamed, "Stop the trains," "We don't have to do this," his top general looked him in the eye and said no. The general told the king that the schedule was too perfect to change. He told him that if they stopped now, the system would break. Think about that. The most powerful man in Europe was told by his own clock that he no longer had the power to stop a massacre. The machine of militarism and alliances had become more powerful than the humans who created it. The Willy-Nicky telegrams are the ultimate proof that World War I wasn't just a war of hate, it was a war of loss of control. The legacy. Why this matters to you. We often look back at 1914 like it's an ancient legend. We see the grainy black and white photos and think we're smarter than that now. But are we? Look around. Today we still have massive military spending. We still have complicated alliances. We still have leaders with massive egos and countries that are hungry for resources. World War I ended the lives of 20 million people. It wiped out 4 empires and changed the map of the world forever. But the biggest lesson it left us is a warning. Peace is not the absence of war. Peace is a choice we have to make every single day. The men of 1914 thought they could play with fire and not get burned. They thought they could build a doomsday machine and never have to use it. They were wrong. If you've watched this far, you now know more than most people ever will about why the world actually went to war. It wasn't just a bullet in Sarajevo. It was a failure of humanity. It was the weight of militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism pulling the world into a grave. The question for us today is simple. Are we building our own M.A.I.N machine right now? And if we are, who will have the courage to stop the trains this time?